Michael, being a student of Irish history, would have been well aware about the failed rebellions, and it was his belief that the best way to beat the British was to make Ireland ungovernable for him, and the way to do that was to do it to an intelligence war, not to have standout battles with a superior country, knowing full well that all it would take for the British would have been 300,000 men to crush Ireland.
I mean, Collins didn't leave things to chance. He didn't leave things, we'll see how it works out on the day. It was meticulous planning, hard work, and a lot of preparatory work.
Every military that you know of uses intelligence always. The fact of the matter is that one of the reasons I started all this research and everything else is I have a military background. I was an intelligence officer for the 82nd Airborne. And the fact of the matter is that intelligence still is the same now as it was then. 4 principles, always 4. Acquisition, analysis, execution, and counterintelligence. Same as always. Collins was incredibly good at all of them. The most important intelligence then, now, human intelligence.
So Michael wanted to bring them to their knees through their failure to administer Irish affairs.
Collins concentrated on Dublin, obviously. While looking at the whole country, he concentrated on Dublin. And that was an effective hands-off approach to the national struggle.
Mícheál Mac Donoghue, Ard Mhair Bhaile Clia, Lord Mayor of Dublin. The threat remained, and in fact Ireland was under essentially martial law in 1918.
It was, I need somebody, or somebody comes to me with information, and you value it, you go back, you get more, and gradually they come in. But if you look around, you will see that a lot of it was voluntary, coming from the people themselves who believed that they had information, they could do something to progress the War of Independence without necessarily going out and fighting.
He was trying to dismantle British intelligence, and he was forced to take men out, and the squad did that.
Collins was adept at making the very best things that had worked in previous guerrilla wars work for him here in Ireland.
However, the years 1917, 1918 tend to get overlooked and so on, but those 2 years are so important into leading into what happens with the War of Independence and Civil War.
Of the intelligence and propaganda war, Collins has written, Ireland's story from 1918 to 1921 may be summed up as a story of a struggle between our determination to govern ourselves and to get rid of British government and the British determination to prevent us from doing either. It was a struggle between 2 rival governments, the one an Irish government resting on the will of the people, and the other an alien government depending for its existence upon military force, the one gathering more and more authority, the other steadily losing ground.
My mother was Breda Collins O'Driscoll, who was a niece of Michael Collins, and her mother was Margaret Collins O'Driscoll, who was Michael Collins's eldest sister. And Margaret Collins O'Driscoll was the eldest in the family, and Margaret herself had 14 children, and my mother was the second youngest. She was the second youngest of the family.
What kind of person was Michael Collins, do you think?
That is a very, very good question, because we have a huge memory of Collins, and Peter Hart, a very well-known historian, talked about the various aspects of Collins. Collins the schoolboy, Collins the sportsman, Collins the young Gaelic leaguer, Collins the hero, Collins the politician, Collins the soldier. So there's a whole load of thoughts and memories, and for recent people, possibly our memory of Collins is influenced by the portrayal by Liam Neeson in the Michael Collins film. So I suppose if you go back to the literature written on Collins, I mean there's 40, 50, 60, 70 books on Collins, and then there's the Marjorie Foster book, which was published about 1969-70, and she would have done a lot, and that, I think the Marjorie Foster book was very good. It very much dealt with Collins the person, the personal, what sort of a person was he. And in fairness to Liam Neeson, Liam portrays Collins very well, the sort of the warmth, the strength of personality, the friendliness, the genuine sort of West Cork hospitality. Liam Neeson portrays that very, very well. He would have done quite an amount of research, reading a huge amount of material on Collins before he played the part, but he would also have met Collins' relatives, and one relative in particular, the late great Liam Collins, who was a solicitor in Clonakilty for many, many years, and Liam Neeson said that he had done all this research, but it wasn't until he visited Liam's house and had dinner and then a glass of whiskey afterwards, he just got the sense of the welcoming and the personality of Collins. It gave him a feeling, it gave him an understanding and an insight into Collins the person, which he really didn't have until then.
Oscar Wilde once wrote, "It is tragic how few people ever possess their souls before they die. Nothing is more rare in any man," says Emerson, "than an act of his own." Michael Collins was most definitely one of those few. From his early days as a boy here in Clonakilty until the day he died, he was always his own man. In these days of corporate shenanigans, where the buck is continuously being passed, in Collins' day, the buck seemed to stop with him. He is my hero.
But the very dedicated organiser, the hugely hard-working person, and also the visionary, Collins the writer as well. If you look at the book that was subsequently published, I think, Moya Llewellyn-Davis, The Path to Freedom, it's a collection of his talks and speeches, and that talks about very much the vision he had for Ireland, you know. And
if we talk about him as a war planner, as an administrator, we do him a grave disjustice, because I think we have to talk about him first as a man. We have to kind of learn a little bit about who he was, because his intelligence, his organization, his energy just galvanized everybody who worked with him, and the views that they had of him are very, very important.
Many of the earlier books were written by people who would have known Collins. Bat O'Connor, Frank O'Connor, Pierce Beasley, Desmond Ryan, and there are probably a number of other books from him. The Rex Taylor book as well. Rex Taylor wouldn't have known Collins, he would have spoken in depth to people who knew Collins.
Michael Noyk was a high-level official and advisor with the Department of Finance, which was then headed by Michael Collins. He describes Michael Collins in 1918. "I used to see Mick Collins every day. He was very young, handsome and full of personality, but I still did not think he possessed the depths which he later showed. He was full of fun and had a keen sense of humour, which he exhibited in practical jokes. He had, in addition, a command of language that even a British Tommy might have envied. A great feature about Michael Collins was that he did not like excuses when a project was suggested, but it was a different matter if the project could not be carried out.
Now I want to walk around with you a little bit in Dublin, because the essence of my books is to take you throughout Dublin and show you that yes, your granny really did live next door to where Collins had a finance office. And yes, your grandfather really did have his draper shop in a place that Collins used as a drop, or that Bat O'Connor might have built a secret compartment into it. Lastly, by way of introduction, I just want to talk about Ireland during the period, particularly Dublin during the period between the Rising and the start of the War of Independence. A great many people think that Ireland was very, very peaceful during those years and nothing really happened, but that's just not true. By 1918, the British had already declared the southwest of Ireland a military area. In 1918, the general headquarters of the IRA was established right down the street here. In 1918, the IRA was banned from raiding private homes for guns, and that was definitely ignored. They continued to raid all the time they could.
cannot stress this point enough, is that it would have been so easy to go back to the gun immediately after what had happened. However, they don't. The Volunteers, Sinn Féin, which is now the party, the political party of the Irish Volunteers, thanks to the media and the British government labelling the rising as a Sinn Féin rebellion, which we know it wasn't. But there's a ready-made political party. A moderate party becomes a hardline party. It is now a Republican party.
It was a year when he was starting to organise his campaign, and he was setting down his markers, and he was. It was an area when a lot of the preparatory work had been done.
At the beginning of 1918, independent groups of volunteers made raid for arms around different parts of the country. A stud farm near Bansha in County Tipperary at the end of January was raided by about 20 masked men calling for arms for the Irish Army. They took neither valuables nor money and apologised to the owner's secretary. A month later, more masked men, including Count Plunkett's surviving son, cleared the armoury and 1,000 rounds of ammunition from Rockingham House near Boyle.
Could you tell me how Sinn Féin were strengthening and regrouping in 1918?
I think of primary importance, the key word is unity, and the regrouping of the intention to gain independence started almost immediately after 1916 when they were imprisoned. Now, many of these are members of Sinn Féin, but with Arthur Griffith in charge, who is an acknowledged, dual monarchist, in his own words, his own strategy, I think there's a desire to gain control of the movement, and there's a desire to go down the political road as well, a very serious one, and I don't think that has been given enough credence, because they make many attempts to gain ground through political initiative, and that's through elections, that's through approaching the Versailles Conference. De Valera's leadership is crucial in this. He has great standing, but at the time he's seen as a tour de force. He's feted wherever he goes. At the time, he's a hero, and he has charisma, and he attracts huge crowds wherever he goes on tour. He's respected by the church, which is vital in winning national support. And remember, this is an all-Ireland movement. It's not just, we tend to think 26-6 nowadays, but at that time you're talking 32. It's very much, I think, an attempt to prove their legitimacy for independence through political means. And it's only when and even when the War of Independence begins, in a small way, they still keep going at Versailles. It's a tragedy in a sense, Versailles, because they're blocked from even being heard.
Versailles is the Paris Peace Conference.
Yes, the Paris Peace Conference. Now, in order to get a hearing at the Peace Conference in Versailles, there had to be agreement among the big four, Italy, France, Britain and the United States. But Britain blocked it. And the other allies didn't want to be seen because they needed something out of Versailles too, so they needed British support, and it was perceived as a domestic issue for Britain rather than an international issue,
they thought they had an argument though with Woodrow Wilson with small nations, I think.
They did, but even Wilson later on, I suppose it was an aspirational thing, and they could guarantee it in cases where it didn't impede upon the imperial powers.
So the system doesn't change, and you find that throughout, that the British government have, whether it's just a lack of understanding or just pure ignorance or an unwillingness to understand the Irish people and the situation in Ireland, and to treat them in a different manner to what the people that they treat in England. It's a completely different situation.
It wasn't just Ireland, I think, that were affected as well, with other countries?
No, I mean, you had Poland, who had been at the mercy of the Prussians and the Russians, Imperial Russia, for centuries. So Poland was looking for independence. Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania, Yugoslavia, the former the Adriatic states.
Collins had recruited other detectives who'd be sympathetic to the cause such as Joe Kavanagh and James McNamara, who worked in Dublin Castle.
Can you tell me about the role and motivations of Ned Broy and why he was so important?
Yeah, Broy was crucially important because he was on the inside. He could get information for Collins, but he could also give him access to get other contacts and to get other information. As regards his motivations, I think it was because he was Irish himself. I think the response of the British in 1916 made a lot of Irish people really question, really, would we be better off running our own country ourselves? After 1916, the executions confirmed this. It was the ruthlessness at which they could execute these people. They could have jailed them, but they turned them into martyrs.
Okay.
They also locked up an awful lot of people who weren't even involved in the 1916, so they turned them into revolutionaries as well. So for people who were in the British administration and establishment, I think they started to question, what am I doing here? What am I serving? Do I want to continue in this role? Nowadays the famine, for example, tends to be thought as separate from as a motivational factor for say Irish nationalism or wanting to run our own country. But at the time it was seen as an example of abusive rule, or misrule.
Ned Broy was concerned about dangers that could appear in the national movement, such as traitors, spies, drinking, loose talk, leakages of information, discovery of papers, unauthorized shootings. Notwithstanding all these dangers, I made up my mind that I would go all out to help them, regardless of the consequences.
The names Ned Broy and David Nelligan would regularly have featured in our house as a child growing up, because these were people, and they lived right up. I mean, Dave Nelligan lived
60s, 70s.
Well, even the 70s. He lived right up to the 70s, and my mother would have known Dave Nelligan, in fact, and so I suppose these were people. These again were people. I think Stephen Ray, if I'm not fully correct, plays the part of Ned Broy, and and he plays it very, very well. But the loyalty and the honour and the commitment he had, and putting his life at risk. They put their own lives at risk.
Yeah, Broy was crucially important because he was on the inside. He could get information for Collins, but he could also give him access to get other contacts and to get other information.
Everything, for example, in Ned Broy's case, everything that passed through his hands, and he had most of the most secret information coming through, everything he passed on, he copied, he made multiple copies. One copy he would pass on through these sort of channels that he had to get the information to.
And it took him a while. And it took Collins a while to trust him, to try and siphon information to make sure he wasn't another intelligence agent on behalf of the RIC or the British.
He took huge risks. He would visit, for example, the Hanrahans in Philsborough, known as the brother of an executed leader. It must have been a house that was known.
Well, then why did Collins trust Broy?
I think because he was able to get him certain documents which proved over time that he was legitimate. And eventually it comes to a point where you have to trust somebody. So Collins would have met him a few times. He would have got the documents from him. He would have seen that he was legitimate. He probably had him followed. And had to introduce members of his own intelligence officers to Broy so that they didn't shoot him.
Collins's main concern was the integration of the volunteers. He was looking at unexplored methods of countering the enemy. Eamon Duggan was the first IRA volunteer Director of Intelligence. He had his legal offices in Dame Street. He was mainly concerned with collecting and collating information that was available in the press, but mostly this was ineffective. Collins was to replace him as the official GHQ director in spring of 1918. Robert Barton, a former British officer, has said about Collins, that when he met him, Collins was the focus for information. See Mick about it was usually what was said from those who were coming up from the country to see his advice.
Of Collins, she said she was never ever sorry for hiring. I gave all the information to Mick, and that gave him the leeway to get ahead. He had the drive, the ability, the force, and the enthusiasm to do it, and he used it very, very well. He assisted in raising money. When they ran short, he would dip into his own pocket to help someone to down and out, and he did it. And the primary persons who worked for the group were coming on. They were the women. They were the ones who went out and raised the funds generally, and they were the ones who dispersed the funds. But in doing so, they carried messages on their person, went out, and it was extraordinarily Collins. That's how he built his women's organization. And afterwards, some of his most successful agents were those very, very women. And he worked for the fund until the spring of 1918. He'd already been in jail. He was just getting out. The fund was starting to wind down because most of the men were back home. And so the fund was going to let him go. But always a businessman, Collins asked him for severance pay. And before he left, he was able to negotiate a month's severance pay for the fund.
Occasionally with Harry Boland, he'd visit Granard. He would often take long walks by the lake with the Kiernan girls. As Michael Collins was recently made Adjutant General, his duty was of travelling the country to organise the Irish Volunteers. In March of that year, Collins was in County Longford to make a speech. It was after Mass on Sunday. Approximately 300 people gathered in the Longford village of Lega to hear what Collins had to say. He read aloud from an Irish Volunteer General Order which called on people to resist conscription by any means possible. Collins decided to add his own few lines to the order. He encouraged people to raid places such as RIC stations for arms. Collins also urged that all young men should emulate the noble martyrs of 1916 who put their own country first. They should join the Irish Volunteers and defend their rifles with their lives. Michael Collins became a regular weekender at Sam Maguire's London flat, where he would discuss with him, as well as other IRB men, how they could open up channels to procure arms which they could use in Ireland.
Collins' view on violence were always well thought on his behalf. He always said, I have strong fighting ideas. Or maybe I should say, I have strong ideas about the utility of fighting. Above all, he was a pragmatist. We find that not only in his operations as an intelligence officer, we find that as a finance officer, we find that in all of his organization. He was concerned about shaping public opinion, and he was concerned about what the violence would do to that public opinion.
At the beginning of March, the headquarters staff of the Volunteers stated raiding of houses for odd guns was strictly prohibited, but that volunteers should not take part in such things. Collins himself, in County Longford, stated that raids on homesteads by Sinn Féin or volunteers were not to be carried out, and this would be in direct opposition to the leaders. He said, if the volunteers wanted arms, they would not have to resort to such methods of raiding farmhouses for useless old shotguns and rusty weapons. Near Dublin, a motor car holding a load of 250 pounds of gelignite was held up by masked men. In Tipperary, on the initiative of Dan Breen, raids on private houses were stepped up in spite of all the headquarters executive previous orders. We generally went at night and asked for the arms, he wrote afterwards. Those who would have liked to refuse knew they dare not. Many others gave them willingly, and some even sent us word to call for them. A young volunteer named Liam Lynch in County Cork became a tough militant Republican. After the 1916 Rising, he chose this moment of the conscription crisis to give up his regular job and devote himself entirely to preparation for an eventual armed struggle.
And amongst those that are elected to the general headquarters staff of the volunteers, Chief of Staff is Richard Mulcahy. Michael Collins becomes Director of Organisation, and then you have Dick McKee, and he becomes Director of Training, and he's promoted to the Commanding Officer of the Dublin Brigade. Now that's a really important position.
And Dick McKee himself, who was he influenced by?
Dick McKee used to give lectures to Irish volunteers, particularly when they were in prison, because it was an ideal opportunity to educate young volunteers. He was particularly influenced by a German officer, a senior officer called von Spohn.
Okay.
So von Spohn basically wrote a book on infantry tactics and independence of command in the field, in that each unit knew the general overall order, but they had flexibility in the field to adapt to a changing situation. And this really made an impact on Dick McKee, because in fighting a guerrilla war, GHQ couldn't control all the strings. There had to be a level of flexibility. Now GHQ did attempt through Mulcahy to have advance attacks submitted in writing to GHQ. Made a big impression on Dick McKee.
Another question to ask is the guerrilla war. Was it controlled and managed from Dublin's general headquarters, or was it more spread out throughout the country?
Well, general headquarters tried. One of the things that makes successful guerrilla wars is you must have some kind of connection to a legitimate government. And that's one of the things that the GHQ here in Dublin tried. It was actually established in March of 1918. The individuals here in Dublin, Michael Collins, Mulcahy, Brula, the others, had a general headquarters that was established here. They did try and exercise control, and mostly they exercised the pace of the guerrilla warfare.
Well, the secret that this store is keeping is that behind it, number 32 Bachelor's Walk, it was the headquarters of the Volunteer Dependence Fund, which was run by Michael Collins in 1918.
A warrant for his arrest was made. Collins was arrested on April 2nd in Dublin City by 2 G Division detectives. When Collins was coming out of his Bachelor Walk office, a group of G-men had pounced on him. Joe McGrath, who was crossing O'Connell Bridge at the time, remembers seeing a crowd gathered, at the centre of which, wildly resisting, was Michael Collins. McGrath had to push his way in and persuade the police to fall back, and he would accompany the reluctant prisoner of Collins. Collins was brought before the court in Longford, where he protested that he'd been kidnapped in Dublin and brought to Longford by an immoral authority. He refused to recognise the court, and he was promptly sent to Sligo jail, where he would await trial. Collins was kept in a corner cell on the top level of Sligo jail for 3 weeks. In jail he kept a diary, and he detailed an appalling loneliness and sleepless nights due to the hard mattress. He wrote about how he must get the wretched mattress changed. When he was not writing in his prison diary, Collins would use the table in the cell to look out the high window. He would stand up on the table and look out at the clear view of Knocknaree Mountain. While in jail, Collins wrote letters to family and friends, and also received visits, including one from Helen Kiernan, who was Kitty Kiernan's sister. Helen was engaged to someone else, but Collins was besotted with her and begged her to marry him instead. Helen would ignore his pleas and marry the solicitor Paul McGovern. On the 10th of April, Michael Collins has written in his diary, "Here alone I am, in a state of appalling loneliness, with the blackest despair in my heart. Of course, the reason for my sadness and loneliness is the thought of the work I might be doing." On the 10th of April, Michael has written a letter to Hanny. He said he was anxious to know what Lloyd George has done about conscription for this country. If he goes for it, well, he's ended.
So we're in the grounds here of Trinity College, and this was the setting for the Irish Convention that took place from the summer of 1917 until the spring of 1918. Now the convention itself, it was boycotted by Sinn Féin, but it was pretty much an attempt to see if they could, take the lid off the pressure cooker that was Ireland in 1917. Ultimately, it did make some ground. It led to some visible common ground between the nationalists of the more moderate nationalists, and even the die-hard unionists did actually see common ground. But unfortunately for the convention, in the spring of 1918, when John Redmond, who was the head of the Irish Parliamentary Party, died, that didn't do it any favours. But what really killed it off was the conscription crisis, which followed in April 1918. That kind of that took everything off the table as far as diplomacy.
And the British government are in great difficulty because they have this thing of home rule. Are they going to introduce it to the Irish people? What form is it going to be introduced? But also, the war is still going on. And certainly by the spring of 1918, it didn't look like the British were actually the Allies were going to win, because the Germans then launched their spring offensive, which is this last ditch attempt to throw everything at the Allies to try to break their ranks. Because America, although in support of the Allies, hadn't actually landed their troops in Europe. And so what the Germans were thinking is, we need to do something before the Americans actually put their troops on the ground. So you have the spring offensive being launched. And it's a very successful campaign for a time. They take a lot of ground, the most ground that had been taken in the war up to that point. So Britain needs soldiers. And finally it's decided that they will enforce or extend conscription to Ireland. So what had been passed 2 years previously is now going to apply to Ireland. Also, they're in such desperate need of soldiers that they extend the military age, so bring it up to men 51, I think it was. So you can see where they need men in Europe to fight this war.
On the 9th of April, Lloyd George had introduced his Manpower Bill in Parliament and extended conscription to Ireland. This was to become law a week later, and the Irish Parliamentary Party, which was lacking in support, withdrew from Westminster. This played into the hands of Sinn Féin. The conscription crisis caused more public anger than the Easter executions of 1916. American opinion was showing itself hostile to Irish conscription.
And the ones that really sort of take credit for it are the church. Now, the hierarchy, Cardinal Logan and so on, they do call together a meeting, and they have that in Stephen's Green. And basically, they come together to sort of organise as in how they're going to get the people to resist conscription, because the way they see it, that this is totally an unnecessary act, and if you are not giving the people the right to self-government, how can you actually be imposing something like this on them? So this should be resisted by everyone. As I say, they meet in Stephen's Green, and you then have contact made with the Lord Mayor of Dublin, as in it's okay that the bishops and the hierarchy are organising, but how then do we get the politicians together? How do we get the people to actually organise against this? So the Lord Mayor, Lawrence O'Neill, he comes together, or basically calls a conference to be held in the Mansion House, and that is held on the 18th of April.
Well, in 1918, the British government attempted to introduce conscription to Ireland, which was to enforce military service in the British Army for all Irish men of military age. And there was a massive campaign of resistance to that. That actually began here in the Mansion House on the 18th of April, when political leaders, trade union leaders, met in this house, and they agreed on a pledge to resist conscription. The Catholic hierarchy were involved, the trade union movement was involved, and as a result of that there was a general strike, which was one of the biggest general strikes in Europe.
After 3 weeks in Sligo jail, Collins accepted bail for £40. Collins was ordered to recognise the court in order to give bail and to get out. He being out to organise was seen as being more important than the Sinn Féin's policy. By given bail meant recognising the court, thus recognising the right of the British administration to prosecute for political reasons, something the Republicans didn't do until then. Upon his freedom, he went straight to Granard in Longford, where local Irish volunteers had assembled on a street to cheer him as he was driven through the town.
He stayed with the Kiernan sisters. Kitty brought him up to date on Harry Boland, as well as activities happening in Dublin. Collins has written to Hanny on the 20th of April, "How long I am left my comparative freedom remains to be seen. The conscription proposals are to my liking, as I think they will end well for Ireland."
You have the church coming, you have the politicians, you have all sections of political life. Moderate nationalists with die-hard Republicans. Everyone comes to resist conscription.
How important was the threat of conscription or anti-conscription to help fuel the fight?
Huge. It's the one unit. In a way, it was a catastrophic political decision by Lloyd George. The threat of this, because there had been casualty lists in the Irish papers for 4 years now. You also had not just the casualty lists, but very graphic accounts of deaths of soldiers, Irishmen in the British Army. Now you had, accounts of heroism as well, but you had graphic accounts of how they died.
Yeah.
And Irish people didn't want their sons heading off to Europe to die for an empire. It's as simple as that. And what this did, this conscription attempt by the British, was it unified the church, it unified the Irish Parliamentary Party with Sinn Féin, and it gave them all one voice, which is unprecedented. This kind of thing doesn't happen very often. And De Valera and Sinn Féin in particular emerge as the leaders of this movement. And it's the acceptance by the church of De Valera's leadership which really puts them in the forefront of a political move towards the general election, which is coming at the end of the First World War.
It seems like the whole of Ireland, with the exception of Ulster, rallies to oppose this act.
Lloyd George had been pressed by Henry Wilson and other military advisors to introduce the Manpower Bill to help him extend conscription to Ireland. On the 16th of April, a week later, it became law. Lloyd George had proposed a Home Rule measure to go hand in hand with conscription. What this would mean would be the rejection of one would mean the enforcement of the other.
And what is very interesting to say is that at first, when the priests or the bishops released a statement condemning conscription, they did urge that the people should resist, but by means of pacifism. So it's not by physical force. They should not resist it physically. So civil disobedience, that's the way they're saying that they should go. In the pledge that is eventually the one that is adopted, that is thrown out. Basically, they're to resist conscription by any means necessary. Now, the priests had also met in Maynooth. The hierarchy had met in Maynooth on the 18th, so the same day that Lord Mayor had his conference. And after that conference had ended in the Mansion House, you then had Eamon de Valera and Arthur Griffin and so on going out to Maynooth to tell basically the hierarchy that this is the pledge that is going to be signed, that is going to be given to the people. So then the priests basically say to their local priest that at Mass on the following Sunday we're going to have these demonstrations against conscription. So you have to say from the pulpit, you have to tell the people what time the Mass are going to be at, where you're going to meet to actually take the pledge, to sign the pledge. And that's what happens all over the country. You have people coming out in force to actually take the pledge, to sign the pledge. But it doesn't end there, because this movement, as I said, it unites everyone. So it is the politicians, it is Sinn Féin, it is the volunteers, it is Cumann na mBan, and it is also the trade union movement, which is really, really important. Pretty much from the get-go, as soon as word came down from the bishops that we need to rally together, you have the trade unions in Belfast and in Dublin, around the country, and they started organising protest meetings. The person who drafts the actual pledge is Eamon de Valera. So you can see you have the extremists, for want of a better word, actually saying that no, we are not going to use passive methods to do this. We've been doing that for the last 2 years, and look at what has happened to us. Look at the way the British government has treated us. We will resist this to the death if need be, and that's an order given to the Irish Volunteers. You do have some attacks on RIC barracks around the country, in Cork and Kerry. The one in Kerry in particular is disastrous because 2 volunteers are killed in that attack. But that's the way they're getting their weapons at the moment.
The turmoil over conscription was a contributing factor to the War of Independence waged by Michael Collins. Dermot Lynch has said in a letter to Pierce Beasley that there was no man in closer touch with Collins than himself. It has been suggested that, due to the close friendship between the IRB comrades Dermot Lynch and Michael Collins, that Collins had a hand in organising Lynch's secret wedding. Dermot Lynch and Collins had collaborated at the end of 1917 and early 1918 on the revision of the Sinn Féin Constitution, the IRB Constitution, and the reorganisation of Irish volunteers. In early 1918, food scarcity was an issue for many Irish people because of increasing exports to England due to them being at war with Germany during World War I. And it was in February 1918 where Dermot Lynch masterminded the seizure of a herd of pigs being driven from the market. They were seized by 24 men led by Lynch. Waiting butchers slaughtered the pigs and the meat was sold to local consumers. The Sinn Féin party repaid the owners for their animals. The Cork Examiner described the pig seizure offence as a startling and unparalleled outrage. Dermot Lynch's co-prisoners were Ernest Blythe, Frank Thornton, Dick McKee and Terence McSweeney. In the coming years, all these men would play a part in Collins' life.
In April 1918, Dermot Lynch was informed that he was to be deported to the USA. He asked for permission to marry his fiancée, Kathleen Quinn of Newbridge, County Kildare, so that she could apply for a passport to travel to the USA with him as his wife. This was refused, so he quietly, with the help of his Republican comrades outside, made the marriage arrangements in Dundalk jail. Kathleen Quinn, with her sister Carmel and Capuchin priest Reverend Father Aloysius Travers, had travelled from Dublin to Dundalk on the morning train. They were escorted into the visitors' room at Dundalk jail and were joined by the Republican prisoners whom they had officially requested to see. Meanwhile, the engaged couple, Lynch and Kathleen Quinn, were grouped in a hushed exchange with the priest. Dermot Lynch, a member of the Supreme Council of the IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood, and Kathleen Quinn were married at noon by Father Aloysius Travers.
After he had announced his marriage to his co-prisoners, Lynch was immediately moved from his cell and placed on a train for Dublin with the armed detectives Patrick Smith and Daniel Hoey. In 12 months, Collins would be paying close attention to those detectives, Smith and Hoey. Lynch arrived in Amiens Street Station, now Connolly Station, and was met by a number of well-wishers, including De Valera and Collins. Harry Boland, who had met Lynch at the station, informed him that the volunteers were prepared to attempt a rescue. Lynch thought it would be a bad idea, as many men would be shot. As Lynch entered the Black Maria, his wife and friends joined him, along with De Valera. The volunteers, who were led by Harry Boland and Michael Collins, marched in front of the Black Maria along the quays to the Bridewell. The following morning, Collins had also joined Dermot and Kit on the train to Kingstown. W.T. Cosgrave says of Collins, "I never knew a man develop so quickly and so profoundly in such a short number of years." Collins was continually developing his communications network. Men who were in prison often received detailed plans from outside. The German Plot, May 1918.
And a big key event that happens after the conscription pledge and so on is the German plot arrests. Now, a complete fabrication by the British government to basically try to destroy Sinn Féin, at the same time weaken the anti-conscription campaign.
I think after the release of the prisoners, I think there was an effort by the British authorities to keep a very tight control on the Irish volunteers. I do think, however, though, the German plot per se was orchestrated as a propaganda event, as an excuse for rounding up prisoners. And the reason I'd suspect that was there was a document I found when I was researching a history of Mayo. It detailed the plans of the Irish volunteers in Mayo to receive a German landing and for the Irish volunteers to move out across the county inland, taking on British forces. Now, such a document would usually be signed by the county inspector. The document was unsigned.
What happened was, in April, you have a chap called Joseph Dowling, who happened to be a member of the Casemates Irish Brigade. He is arrested in Clare. He comes over in a collapsible boat, but he had been a member of Casemates Brigade, and so the British authorities see this that, oh, this is another German plot. This is another 1916. They've been seeking help from Germany. We're going to have another rising. Now we're going to strike first. Now, they did plan to arrest pretty much everyone and anyone they could.
From the 2nd of May, Irish policy would be shaped by Colonial Secretary Walter Long. Long was a former Conservative Chief Secretary and an Irish Unionist leader. The new Viceroy was Lord French, who had been Chief of the Imperial General Staff. French had strongly supported the execution of the 1916 Easter Rising leaders. Between the 6th and 10th of May, 1918, Long and French consulted with Basil Thompson, who was the then head of Special Branch in London. Thompson had played a hand in the Black Diaries, which sealed the fate of 1916 leader Roger Casement. Walter Long saw Ireland as of strategic importance and demanded that the most drastic steps should be taken to stamp out pro-German intrigues. Edward Carson had also claimed in the Times that the government had incontrovertible evidence of a Sinn Féin plot. Long had instructed Thompson to compile a list of the Republican ringleaders. Long had informed Thompson that arrests were planned for the Friday.
Dublin Castle detective Joe Kavanagh arrived at Capel Street Public Library one day and handed the librarian Thomas Gay the names of key people that were to be arrested. Gay then passed that list on to Harry Boland. Mick Collins had already received a warning from Ned Broy. This list now had his name on it.
Ned Broy was secretly leaking this information to Harry O'Hanrahan.
On the night of Friday, 17th of May, Collins had attended a meeting of the Sinn Féin executive. He had tried to warn them of the impending arrest of those on the list.
Collins had tipped off Sinn Féin leaders such as De Valera, Griffith and Countess Markievicz in Harcourt Street on the 17th of May. Griffith and De Valera understood the propaganda value if they allowed themselves to be arrested.
However, you do have Eamon De Valera and so on saying to people, do not go on the run, stay in your home. Because the one thing that De Valera was always very aware of was propaganda and the value of propaganda and how you can use that as a weapon in your favour.
Thompson had even stated that De Valera, who had always said he would not be taken alive, went like a sheep. However, some of Dublin Castle's detectives found it odd that some of the arrested suspects had already their belongings packed when caught, like they were predicting a journey.
About 80 are arrested altogether and they're then put in prison in England. And all the while you still have this pretext going on that somehow we can introduce a form of home rule that will appeal to both the Unionists and the Nationalists. It's not going to happen.
On the 17th of May, British authorities decided not to implement conscription in Ireland, but by then the reaction had solidified support for Sinn Féin. On the night of 18th of May 1918, Mick advised certain members to go on the run. He advised Kathleen Clark that she was on the list. She wasn't physically fit to go on the run. That night she was watched and was arrested the next morning. Collins decided to head to Sean McGarry's house to warn him, but already he saw that the raid had begun. Collins could just stand there with the other onlookers as McGarry was taken away. Collins interestingly decided to go into the house and sleep in McGarry's bed. He told Ernie O'Malley, "I knew it would be the safest bed in Dublin."
Amongst those who escaped were mostly radicals like Collins, Harry Boland and Cathal Brugha, allowing the radical wing to take over most of the movement. Collins' power and standing in the movement was transformed.
Harry Boland took over the direction of Sinn Féin while Michael Collins concentrated on the volunteers.
It was the first time the intelligence network that Collins was starting to build had any effect.
Collins concentrated on organization, but then he became involved in intelligence, and he really found his niche in intelligence. That's how he was. But when he started out with all of these, whether it's intelligence, organization, finance, he had to teach himself. Intelligence, for example, shows us exactly how much he had to learn. There was a man named Joe Kavanaugh, but he was the one who really found out the locations of the people who were going to be arrested for that German plot, remember, during the conscription crisis. He was very important, and he got that information to Collins. Collins took this information, and afterwards, he talked to Kavanaugh's man and his contact, and he offered him £5. And he said, give this to Kavanaugh. Well, Thomas Kane knew that Kavanaugh would be extremely embarrassed to think that he was known for spying for money. So the money was never, of course, passed along. Collins had a lot to learn, and he did learn it, but he started from ground zero.
Also in May, Michael had asked Joe O'Reilly, his friend, to join him in his work. O'Reilly would have a number of roles, including that of clerk, cook, valet, courier. He would have to suffer Michael's many moods. O'Reilly would also help carry out detective work.
Gearóid O'Sullivan was to take up whole-time work as Adjutant General of the Volunteers after the German plot at the request of Michael Collins.
Michael kept in contact with his friend Austin Stack, who with Fionn Lynch, Ernest Blythe and others was in Belfast jail. Stack would write back to Michael's cousin Nancy O'Brien, who worked in the GPO.
Whenever one of his men or anyone was thrown into jail, he always made sure that that individual got his own favorite tobacco or his favorite cigarettes, and he would smuggle that into the jail for them. Once when Kathleen Clark was in jail, he smuggled some candies into her. He said, I know you don't smoke, but I know you like sweets. So he would try and do everything he could for his individuals all the time, whether in jail or out of jail or not. He was a very kind man, and he wasn't afraid to laugh or cry with his people.
So it's basically trying to bribe people to join the British Army, and there is resistance against that. And again, it's just going back to showing that either it's an unwillingness to understand Ireland or a complete ignorance. So we have the response from the people, they come out in their droves, and we have the response from the volunteers where they are ready to resist by force. The women. And the women of Ireland come out in their droves to resist conscription. Some do take part, obviously, in the event on the 24th of April because everyone was at Mass, so everyone goes to Mass. However, you do have concerted effort by the women of Ireland to have their own day of reckoning. For them to say that I am not going to send out anyone's husband, anyone's son, my brother, to join a foreign army to fight a foreign war. And they are so successful. Now, it becomes known as Lánamán, and it happens on the 9th of June, and that's the feast of St. Columcille. Now, the church are in support of this, and they announce in the newspapers and so on that the women are going to have their own day. And what happens again all over the country, the women turn out, and the way this seems to have worked was they met at their local churches and then they either went to a public place, a place of prominence in the town, signed a pledge, and then if there is, they have a procession somewhere else. The newspapers are full of reports of how successful Lánamán actually was. Now, what's really interesting to know is that 2 days after, you have a proclamation being issued by the British government saying that you cannot have a meeting in public without the permission of the police.
Collins had this army of women working for him. He didn't like women in uniform at all. He always told the women who worked for him, if they were members of Cumann, never wear your uniforms. And he was not real particular to women in politics. but he had an army of people working for him. He simply could not have worked without them. That's it. Nancy O'Brien, Lily Murden, Molly O'Reilly, Eileen McGrain, Sister Etna Wallace, a nun. She worked for him as a secretary, joined a convent. She still worked for him.
Sir James McMahon was director of the Posts and Telegraphs Office in 1918 to 1919. He had called in Nancy O'Brien, who was Michael Collins' second cousin, who worked in the post office. He told her the management knew of her dedication and work and wanted to promote her within the department. He explained that they knew that Collins had information even before the officers to whom it was sent received it.
She worked as deciphering all the codes in Dublin Castle. When she was given that job, they told her, "We've watched your work and we see how good and diligent you are, and we think you're going to do the best." And when she told Collins, he said, "My God, how have they had this empire for so long to pick you to do the coding?" The women were invaluable to Collins. He could not have lived without them.
As a spy, Nancy was invaluable to Michael. She would often spend her lunchtime in the ladies' toilets, copying papers to give to him later. Once when Collins berated her for not finding a message that he was particularly interested in, she turned on him angrily.
All she saw, she told him, was some rubbish about Angela's bells and some admirer talking about the light glinting in her hair. "What sort of an idiot are you anyway?" he cried. "That's the message I'm looking for." In an instant he had figured it out. The warders change at 6 o'clock and our target man will be in his room when the light goes on.
Later that night he went to her home in Glasnevin and apologised, leaving a present of her favourite bullseye candies for her.
This is 118 Clonliffe Road, and this was owned by Dr. Moynihan. Now, Lily Mernon, the typist from Dublin Castle, she used to make copies, carbon copies of the documents that she was typing up, and she would come out here of an evening, and it was one of the places that she used.
Statement by Miss Lily Mernon. I was employed as a shorthand typist in the Garrison Adjutant's Office, Dublin District, Lower Castle Yard, during the years 1914 to 1922. Pierce Beasley, who is a relative of mine, used to visit my house, and during the course of conversation I may have made some references to the work on which I was engaged in Dublin Castle. Apparently Beasley spoke to Michael Collins about me, because sometime in 1918 Michael Collins asked to meet me, and Pierce Beasley brought him to my home and introduced him to me as a Mr. Brennan. I did not know he was Collins at the time. He asked me would I be willing to pass out to him any information that might be of value which I would come across in my ordinary day's work. I remember he produced letters that he had intercepted concerning some of the typists and officers in the castle, and things that were happening generally. I cannot remember exactly what they were. I promised to give him all the assistance that I possibly could. I cannot recollect the exact nature of the letters and correspondence that I passed to the intelligence staff. All I can say is that, in general, they dealt with the movement of troops, provisions for armoured trains or cars, and instructions and circulars issued to military units from GHQ.
Lily Mernon worked at Ship Street Barracks, and she worked at the British Army headquarters in Parkgate Street. Everything Broy saw that came across his desk, he would make an extra carbon copy. Lily Mernon did exactly the same thing. Everything that crossed her desk, there was another carbon for Collins. Every one. She would also smuggle out documents inside her clothes, go to a safe house at night, type up summations of these, and then bring the documents back the very next day. She was invaluable.
But she used to enter the house Brew, the latch used to be left off on the side gate. She would go in there at a time when she knew that there was nobody else in the house. When she got inside, she would reproduce the message. There was a typewriter in there, and she'd type out the message, she'd put it in a little envelope, and she'd leave it in a specific part of the house where somebody else, after she had left, so she'd never meet them, they would come along and they would get the information about who was living where, or whatever information that they needed to organise the next stage of their operations.
We need to be centralised and we need to be focused, and if you're going to attack someone, it has to come, the authority has to come from Dublin. So Cattle Brew is really adamant about this, so it is decided then that a general headquarters staff will be set up. Now, Cattle Brewer is really frustrated by what's going on. So he is, in effect, the Minister for Defence, and he comes up with his own plan to deal with the British government if they do try to enforce conscription. Now, this did cause some controversy between Michael Collins and Chief of Staff Richard Mulcahy. But Cattle Brewer saw this was the only way that he could effectively do something to show that the volunteers would resist conscription. And that plan was to go over to London with a squad of men. I think Joe McGrath is one of the men that agrees to go. And his plan was that if they did try to enforce conscription, that then they would assassinate members of the Parliament or the government that voted to actually enforce conscription.
Joe Good has recalled in his witness statement the journey that Cathal Brugha had made with himself and Bill Whelan to London. He was told about an incident in the House of Commons featuring Cathal Brugha, Matt Furlong and Bill Whelan. You missed it. Cathal took Matt and me into the gallery of the House of Commons. We went in on Janelle's ticket. Bonar Law was speaking. Cathal stood up and looked over the gallery, but Bonar Law was out of sight and underneath us. Cathal could not possibly have hit him from his position in the gallery. He had his Peter the Painter underneath his coat. An usher approached us and told Cathal not to stand up or look over the gallery. The house was nearly full of members in uniform. At least we would have been firing at soldiers. Yes, said Joe Good, I certainly have missed it.
April 1918, and he's there until October. Until the actual threat has passed, Cattle Brew will not come home until that threat has passed. So again, it just shows that this was a man that was willing to lead from the front. Now, at that time, the volunteers were not the sort of cohesive group that they become in 1919, but Cattle Brewer isn't the only one that has a plan to attack the authorities if conscription is introduced. Now again, the volunteers do not have the weapons that they would need to engage in a large-scale assault like you have in 1916. If there's big engagements, how are you going to do this? Despite that, this is the first time you have to attack the Custom House being put on the agenda, and that's by Dick McKee in 1918. Now, his plan was nothing like the one that they actually did do in 1921, and it was basically to have in 1916 again. The way it would work with that was that you'd have local men from the inner city, so the area surrounding the Custom House. It was local men in the volunteers that would isolate their streets, so it's not men coming out or coming in from an outside area. You're using local men, so they knew where to go. So they would control their streets. They isolate every street, so that if the military do come, they can then successfully, somehow without arms, protect this or their area. The very interesting thing about this is that the operation was sanctioned by GHQ. So the whole thing, when we look at 1921, when it comes to saying that Michael Collins was against the attack on the Custom House in 1921, well, that question has to be asked, well then, why did he sanction it? Why did GHQ sanction it in 1918? So the point I'm making there is the Custom House is always in the eyes of the volunteers. It's just a matter of time, and the only reason that it's not attacked at that time is because conscription isn't introduced. But you can only imagine what would happen, because they weren't a cohesive unit, and also they haven't got the weapons. But it shows their willingness to resist conscription by any means necessary.
Collins's view on violence were always well thought on his behalf. He always said, I have strong fighting ideas. Or maybe I should say, I have strong ideas about the utility of fighting. But after conscription and the crisis passed, in May and June of 1918, Ireland's violence came right back up again before the War of Independence started, which of course led us to guerrilla warfare. Whatever it's called, it's very, very localized. You have to have great intelligence, you have to be very mobile, you have to have gun drops, you have to have the support of the people.
That while we had certainly at the top coordinators, we had people like Collins who would guide what was going on. Local commanders were doing their own thing. Local commanders were doing what they felt they needed to do in the area, what they were capable of doing.
Had he much dealings with Collins, Michael Collins?
Yes, well, that would be during the Black and Tan time. Actually, he didn't care for Collins. One thing, he found him a bully.
Yeah.
But then I remember him saying something like this, like they were row at Collins, he's hot-tempered, but he didn't make it up then. But he did do work under Collins, all right, yes.
Frank Henderson has said in his witness statement that as soon as we came together in Clonliffe Hall, there began in the companies of the 2nd Battalion a period of unremitting intensive organising, training and planning which did not cease until the truce in July 1921. They had been meeting here since 1917. Parades, training, arming of the company, a company fund, recruitment and mobilisation plans were learned here.
What's this? We're on Holy Cross Avenue here, and this building here, the white building, was known then as Clonliffe Hall, and this was where the 2nd Battalion re-established themselves in the period between the Rising and the War of Independence. It was raided at one stage by Detective Smith, and the volunteers had to get out and try and scramble over this wall here, which they did. I'm not sure if the wall was the same then, but there was a wall here, and that's they made their way into the college. Once that was done, they had to move out of Clonliffe Hall, obviously, and reposition their headquarters elsewhere.
Vinnie Byrne discusses in his witness statement that activity was beginning to buzz again in the country as far as arms were concerned. At a parade of the company in Clonliffe Road, it was the joy of my life when I was handed a .45 revolver and 6 rounds, arms being secured from various sources. Mick MacDonald had had a supplier in Island Bridge, which is now Clancy Barracks, who supplied a good many arms to him. Rifles received from Island Bridge Barracks were often left in a public house in the Coyningham Road, and they were called for at night time. Supplies of weapons were also given by Phil Shanahan, who is a publican in Corporation Street. Vinnie Byrne also states that our place of mobilisation was Oriel Hall, Oriel Street, until the battalion got a hall on Clonliffe Road, where all the companies in the battalion met on different nights in the week. Battalion classes and several battalion council meetings were held there. Vinnie Byrne recalls getting raided while at a class in Clonliffe Road, learning Morse code with Sean Lamass. A lorry full of police arrived at Clonliffe Road to arrest the volunteers. Some of the volunteers escaped through the grounds of Clonliffe College, but a large number of B Company were arrested, according to Frank Henderson's witness statement. Some of the captains of companies B to F were Leo Henderson, captain of B Company, Patrick Moran, captain of D Company, Richard McKee, captain of E Company, and Frank Henderson, captain of F Company. Lieutenants included some future squad members who would fight under Collins' directions in the future. They would include Sean Russell, Patrick Daly, Oscar Traynor. Second lieutenants included Vinnie Byrne, Sean Lamass, and Martin Savage. Quartermaster was future squad leader Michael McDonnell. In July 1918, a change of venue was made to the Londonderry Assizes issued on the 28th of June 1918. His appearance was scheduled for the 17th of July, but Collins did not appear. A bench warrant was executed on that date. As a consequence of this, his description was inserted in the Dublin Castle newspaper Hue and Cry under County Longford. After that, Collins was officially on the run and remained so until the truce.
So, why did Collins consider the RIC the real threat and not the British Army?
Because a lot of them were Irish.
Yeah.
And they had been, I mean, you just think about it.
Yeah.
If you're a policeman on the beat or an intelligence officer working for, say, police intelligence, and you're moving around a city or a country or a particular area,
Yeah.
you get to know the characters.
Yeah.
You get to know their movements.
Yeah.
So this personal knowledge,
Yeah.
the RIC, grave threat to the Republican movement. And in particular, I suppose their identification of key members after 1916 had got them executed.
Yeah.
So it was their ability to identify, their ability to move within the city, because people were afraid of them, remember?
Yeah.
You know, at this point. That's why. But you read the reports.
Okay.
They're highly effective.
Okay.
They detail everything
Yeah.
that is said, who says it,
Yeah.
where they meet, how many attended, how the funding that they get, who donates what at meetings. Now they could only get that kind of information with touts on the other side as well.
Yeah.
So each individual policeman or detective had his own informants.
Okay.
Right? So for Collins, you cut them out and you blind the British establishment, because it's a lot harder for them to fit in because of their accent, their mannerisms, their bearing. It's all different.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all different.
Well over 1,000 rallies were held countrywide on August 18th, 1918. These rallies were organised by Cumann na mBan, Gaelic League members, Sinn Féin and the volunteers. Collins has written to Hanny, "The conscription proposals are to my liking, as I think they will end well for Ireland." Collins gathered data of every volunteer company, every brigade and every battalion nationwide. To do this, he needed couriers. Some of these couriers included Sheila Humphreys, Moira Comerford and Leslie Price. They would travel up and down the country with forms containing inventories of arms and equipment. Michael wanted to avoid arrest and moved his office to a cellar known as the Dugout in St. Itas in Ranelagh. This was one of the schools which were founded by Patrick Pearse, and it was from there he was to conduct meetings and intelligence business. According to Joseph O'Connor's witness statement, Dick McKee's next great achievement was the founding and publication of An Tuglach. He was a printer by trade and he produced the whole paper himself. For a long time, this office functioned at number 10 Ainger Street. In July 1918, Michael asked Pierce Beasley to become editor of the secret journal An Tuglach. Between 18th of February and 19th of October 1918, receipt books were opened and used by Collins. These receipt books recorded the affiliation of 689 companies and special units. These companies would subscribe 10 shillings to a scheme of organisation that was issued by GHQ from Collins's office in Bachelor's Walk. A complete reorganisation of the Irish Volunteers was underway. Collins had a direct responsibility to impose this scheme of organisation through An Tuglach magazine. An Tuglach magazine would show the authority of the GHQ to the Irish volunteer companies on the ground around the country. Collins contributed a regular column titled Notes on Organisation. Each company affiliated with the Irish Volunteers became subscribers of the magazine.
There battle cry and freedom rise to that Easter sky. They were the men with the vision, the men with the cause, the men who defied their oppressors' laws, the men who traded and changed for guns, born into slavery they were freedom's sons.
Austin Stack, Fionn Lynch and Ernest Blythe were in Belfast jail. Many of Collins' letters to Belfast were addressed to Stack directly. Collins has written to Stack on the 19th of August that the Sinn Féin organisation lacks direction at the present moment. The men who ought to be directing things are too lax and spend little or no time at number 6.
He once said that he who controls Dublin controls Ireland, and I think that's very, very true. But even then, he thought in the very way that he did later on. He always said that organization, and no matter how methodical, even if unorthodox, has been beaten every time. So his outstanding ability was an ability to reach to the very heart of a matter very quickly. He was detail-oriented, and he could achieve simplicity no matter how complex the things were, but he always thought about the detail. And he thought about this in his private life as well. He was very detail-oriented there. I think he was an administrative genius. I think he ran the revolution as a modern-day CEO would run a corporation. He always stressed the minimum force necessary. He wanted to achieve his purpose, but minimally. On the other hand, he did believe in the military principle of getting your revenge in first.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because it's evident from Antogloch and articles published in it that the Irish Volunteers, as reconstituted after 1916, were very aware of other wars, different types of warfare, which had been carried out against strong empires. Like you had the Boer War against the British Army in South Africa, and the activities of a General de Wet. You also had the Cuban-Spanish War, which Churchill and a colleague of his, Barnes, had actually witnessed. They had gone there to look at it, and they had reported on the guerrilla army wearing civilian clothes with the simple armband or patch which could be removed so they could melt into the crowd. How they also followed Leto Vorbeck, who was a German officer in German East Africa, who fought a 4-year guerrilla campaign against the British and was never defeated. So they had looked at these, they had analysed them, and they had decided to, I suppose, carry out a war which was not conventional. In 1916, they had worn uniforms, they had carried out a conventional strategy, they had been defeated and all their leaders executed. The serious question was, what were they going to do? And they analysed the other major conflicts where there was a success against empires and proceeded to try and emulate those in a unique Irish setting.
Now, could you tell me how important was Antogloch?
So the strategy which was employed, the type of articles, in terms of bomb making, in terms of explosives, in terms of military strategy and education, in terms of spirit and morale, these were the main kind of themes which ran through the various different issues of it at the early stages after 1916.
On Antogloch magazine, 14th of September 1918. Collins' organisation notes in Antogloch magazine. The company, as is laid down in the scheme of organisation, the above forms a tactical unit of the volunteer system. And for all who are connected with volunteer development and volunteer work, it is the first special object of attention. It is the foundation stone of the volunteer military edifice. On its soundness depends the durability of the whole structure. Collins has also said in this issue of Antogloch magazine, remember that we have to depend on the goodwill, mutual confidence and instinctive patriotism of the men for discipline and service. The organisation's scheme provides for such special services as engineering, scouting, dispatch riding, signalling, transport and supply, and first aid. Of course, the men engaged in these specialised activities must also be riflemen. It is to ensure that the company shall be in a position to take independent military action that all its special services must be incorporated.
In terms of explosives, for example, they wanted to make sure that units could actually produce their own explosives easily without actually killing themselves in the process. The morale is very vociferous, it's very aggressive in terms of identifying what they're going to do to collaborators, who is liable to be shot, executed. I mean, they stated it in advance.
There are characteristics of all civil wars, and particularly all guerrilla wars. You have to have great intelligence, you have to be very mobile, you have to have gun drops, you have to have the support of the people. All those characteristics are there, but they have to be adapted to the local area. Collins did a brilliant job, and he was the first one to adapt those characteristics to an urban environment. He was really the prototype of an urban guerrilla.
On Tugluk, 30th of September 1918. Collins' organisation notes: the company and company officers. The company captain is responsible for all matters affecting the efficiency, the discipline, the training and the conduct of his company. Above all, the general organisation of his unit is almost entirely in his hands. He must divide it up into sections and appoint suitable commanders for these sections. He must have before his mind the question of how men are likely to work together, of the probability of, say, a speedy mobilisation, and the importance in such a contingency of having section commanders living within easy reach of himself and his officers on the one hand, and of the men in their sections on the other. Certain duties and activities will be assigned to other officers and men, but his is the obligation to see that these are capably performed. In an army like ours, against which the enemy for the time being has the political as well as the military advantage, it is essential that units should not entirely depend on the existence and energies of one man. The enemy may at any moment remove an officer. It is incumbent on us to have our organisations so developed that another will be fully trained to fill his place and continue his labours.
In September, Lord Lieutenant French indicated that the English government's policy towards conscription for Ireland remains unchanged. On Tugluk, in response to Lord French's statement, editorialised, "It is desired that we should eliminate all talk and all thought of passive resistance, because passive resistance means, in effect, no resistance at all. We must fight with ruthlessness and ferocity. We must recognise that anyone, civilian or soldier, who assists directly or by connivance in this crime against us, merits no more consideration than a wild beast, and should be killed without mercy or hesitation as opportunity offers."
Collins was bedbound and had received a crippling attack of pleurisy. He has written to Stack on the 12th of October, "I'm fed up today. It's the first time for 8 years I've felt it necessary to stay in bed." On Tugluk magazine, 29th of October. On Tugluk talks about the future in the 29th of October issue, and the fact that it was clear that the war, being World War I, is drawing to a close. Rather than relaxing training, On Tugluk had argued that it was absolutely essential and imperative that Irish volunteers should concentrate upon their work and bring their military efficiency up to the highest pitch.
Remember, in all guerrilla warfare, the guerrillas simply have to keep existing. As long as the guerrilla army is in existence, it's doing its job. The government has to win. The guerrillas do not.
Dolores Decker, is it?
That's her there, yeah. Yeah, Dolores Decker, she lived across on number 30, Mount Joy Street, across from Mrs. McCarthy had a lovely place there called the Munster Hotel. Yeah. And it was in that Munster Hotel that she was from Kerry, of course. And it was in the hotel that Michael Collins would have came and Emma De Valera would have came. And even during the height of the War of Independence, and even in the Civil War, De Valera would come at 3 o'clock to collect a clean shirt or to get his dinner and say, you better leave them, Mr. De Valera, because Mr. Collins is going to be arriving shortly. Right. But Dicker lived across the road. The Dickers lived across the road. She was a great piano player. Yeah. And she was sitting at front window. And she was also, many a time when Collins did come down the road, he would pop into her house. She was also keeping information on him and that like. You see no one looking at it. It's terrible, isn't it?
It is, considering what you did, like, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Dolores Decker, yeah.
Molly O'Reilly was another. She was only 15 in the Rising. And she continued her activities and worked at the Hibernian Services Club on St. Stephen's Green afterwards. And she worked very closely with Per Clancy. And when some of the British would come in and check their coats, check their everything at the desk, they'd also check their weapons. And sometimes when they were back, their coats were gone and so were their weapons.
The signing of the armistice happened in November 1918, which put an end to World War I. The celebration of the end of World War I in Dublin had occasional sporadic encounters. Collins has written to Stack, there were 125 cases of wounded soldiers treated at the Dublin hospitals that night. Before morning, 3 soldiers and 1 officer had ceased to need any attention, and 1 other died the following day. 180,000 Irish men had volunteered for war service. At the end of the war, 49,000 of those would have fallen in battle. Lloyd George called for a general election. Sinn Féin were ready for this fight. Also, the British Parliament allowed for the first time women over 30 to vote. Sinn Féin courted both women and men who were new voters. Many Sinn Féin members were in jail. So it fell on Michael Collins, Harry Boland, Father Michael O'Flanagan, Dermot O'Hegarty, Hannah Shee Skeffington and Jenny Wise Power to help select candidates to promote the campaign. After Harry Boland and Michael Collins were done dealing with the candidates, they were all staunch Republicans. Collins was to take a somewhat dark interest in the health of nationalist MPs. If he suspected that one may be ill or showing signs of weakness, this was enough of a good reason to send Sinn Féin candidates into the constituency. On Tugluck magazine, 15th of November 1918, Collins's organisation notes looked at the battalion. He has said, having dealt in detail with the company, I will now go on to the next volunteer unit, the battalion. An ordinary battalion comprises 4 or more, but not exceeding 7 companies. As in all volunteer organisations, this arrangement is not rigid. In certain districts, fewer companies than 4 are allowed to form a battalion, and in certain special circumstances, where conditions warrant it, more than 7 companies may be allowed. It must, however, be clearly understood that any departure from the official scheme, whether allowed as a temporary arrangement or because of unusual conditions, can only be made with permission of General Headquarters. In grouping together a certain number of companies to form the battalion, the things to be borne in mind are A. Military suitability, B. Geographical position, C. General convenience to ensure smooth and efficient working, D. Territorial extent of the battalion area. Also in this issue of An Tugluck, it has stated that the report of the Director of Organisations submitted to the representative meeting of officers showed how astonishing had been the growth of the Irish volunteers during the past year. There were now 1,200 affiliated companies as compared with 390 at the time of last year's convention. This increase has not been confined to any portion of the country, but has been equally marked in every province and every district.
And what he said was, my methods are the only way for a small nation to take on a large nation in an empire.
On 30th of November 1918, Tuglach magazine talks about the armistice. It has stated that the pretense that peace has come, as far as this country is concerned, is the most audacious falsehood. The real essential fact, though, at the back of all this is the 200,000 armed British soldiers, slaves, employed to enforce slavery. They are England's one real argument in support of her claim to Ireland. Finally, it is of the utmost importance to develop what I may call a battalion outlook. It is a common failing with battalion commandants that they think too much of the particular company in their own immediate neighbourhood. When a company officer is raised to battalion rank, he must remember that his command no longer consists of one unit, but of a group of units, all of equal importance and requiring equal care and attention. Collins's organisation notes have said that the battalion commandants are responsible for all matters affecting the organisation, training, discipline, equipment and general efficiency of his battalion. He has made a note of whatever subdivision of duties may be made, either by the commandant himself or provided under the organisation scheme, whatever task may be assigned to the other battalion and company officers, it is he who is ultimately accountable for all volunteer activities within his battalion.
Where women over the age of 30 got the vote. Now, not all women, there was women whose either they had property or their husbands had property, men over the age of 21 got the vote. But you can see that with that extension of the vote to the women, it's a huge increase in people that are now going to vote. The general election is called after the World War ends in November. On the 14th of December, we do have the general election and Sinn Féin win overwhelmingly. You have 73 out of 105 seats are won by Sinn Féin. So that friendliness that was between the Irish Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin in the anti-conscription campaign is well and truly dead. And that vote, that election, it's more, I would say, a protest vote or an anti-conscription vote rather than, oh look, we're all in favour of Sinn Féin or in favour of a republic. It really was a test to the Irish people, or a chance for the Irish people to use their vote to say this is how you are treating us, with contempt. And it really was contempt that the government were treating the Irish people. And it is a response to that treatment of the way they will try to enforce conscription on Ireland without actually giving the people a chance to discuss it or to vote on it themselves.
The December elections brought a sweeping victory to Sinn Féin. Collins was elected unopposed. Sinn Féin had comprehensively defeated the Redmanite parliamentarians. The volunteer newspaper on Tuglach, the young warrior or soldier, stated that the Irish volunteers are the army of the Irish Republic in December 1918. About this time, the term Irish Republican Army came into widespread use. The Irish electorate had voted overwhelmingly for the separatist Sinn Féin party. Sinn Féin took their victory in the election to be a mandate for complete independence, and in January of the following year declared an Irish Republic and its Parliament, the Dáil, to be the legitimate government of Ireland. Sinn Féin activist P.S. O'Hegarty has said, "It declared to the British that they had no claim to Ireland which was not rendered null and void by the Irish people's definitive repudiation of any such claim, and that the only fast and constitutional government in Ireland was the government of Dáil Éireann, which was elected by the people and represented the people." On the basis of the democratic will of the majority, Ireland would show that it could unilaterally declare independence. Such was the extent of the management of the selection process by Collins, Boland and Dermot O'Hagerty that many of the candidates, especially those who were in jail, did not even know that their names had been put forward, and were no doubt surprised to receive messages of congratulations on their success at the polls. Harry Boland announced the Sinn Féin winners of the most notable contests from a balcony. Fionn Lynch had no idea of his candidacy for the election. He only found out about this when he was congratulated when he received on being elected unopposed for South Kerry. Collins himself was one of the 25 Sinn Féin candidates returned unopposed. John Dillon of the Nationalist Party had lost to De Valera. The election of 1918 ended the era brought in by the Act of Union. The election was held on the 14th of December 1918, but the count was postponed until the 28th of December. Sinn Féin won 73 seats, but with 4 candidates elected to 2 seats, De Valera, Griffith, Owen McNeill and Lee Mellows,
This photograph just shows you that the old Ireland, the Ireland that once would have accepted Home Rule, that once would have accepted the Irish Parliamentary Party, has now gone. Because these men were going to represent Ireland. And where they were going to represent them was in Ireland. Not in the Parliament in England, like had been done so before, but they saw the best way to represent the Irish people was in Ireland, in an Irish Parliament. Because in terms of 1916 to 1924, so many things happened, but for 6 months, the people of Ireland showed that you will not enforce your will on us.
Collins commented, "Gone forever were policies which were a tacit admission that a foreign government could bestow freedom, or a measure of freedom, upon a nation that had never surrendered its national claim." Countess Markievicz was one of the first women elected to the House of Commons, but she stayed loyal to her election pledge along with all the other Sinn Féin candidates and refused to take her seat. Instead, a first Dáil would be set up to convene in January 1919. Father Michael O'Flanagan, Vice President of Sinn Féin, has stated, "The people have voted Sinn Féin. What we have to do now is to explain to them what Sinn Féin is." At the end of 1918, over 1,000 Irishmen had been arrested. 91 deportation orders and 973 sentences had been passed. 1 man had died in prison. 12 newspapers had been suppressed. Over 80 bayonet and baton charges had been made in which 5 men had died, and innumerable meetings had been proclaimed. Areas of greatest volunteer concentration were Cork, Limerick, Kerry, Tipperary.
Unfortunately, in Irish history, politics and violence do go hand in hand. If you look back to 1798, 1803, and then Daniel O'Connell, it all goes together. You cannot seem to have one without the other. But thankfully, the people of Ireland did come together, they did stand up, and they said no to the greatest power on this earth, the leaders of the biggest empire and greatest empire this world has ever seen. And they didn't get their own way in 1918.